The neighborhood had mostly moved on from the drama. There were new things to talk about. The Hendersons were renovating their kitchen. Someone had seen a coyote 3 streets over. The elementary school was getting a new playground. Carol's fence situation had become old news. Just part of the neighborhood history now, but something interesting had happened in the months since James put up his fence. Other neighbors had started setting their own boundaries with Carol. Robert had installed bollards at the end of his driveway. It's the kind that prevented cars from pulling in. Carol had apparently thrown a fit about it, claiming she needed to turn around somewhere, but Robert had held firm. Use your own driveway or the cul-de-sac, like everyone else, he told her. Angela had hired a lawn service that specifically collected all the grass clippings instead of blowing them. When Carol's service continued to blow clippings into Angela's yard, Angela had politely spoken to the service owner and shown him property lines. Now Carol's service contained their clippings. And Angela's lawn looked better than it had in years. Mr. Chen had planted a row of decorative bushes along his front property line. Nothing aggressive. Just a clear, natural boundary that made it obvious where the sidewalk ended and private property began. It was like James's stand had given other people permission to protect their own spaces. Carol had spent years conditioning the neighborhood to accommodate her. And now that conditioning was breaking down. James ran into Carol's husband at the hardware store one Saturday. They'd exchanged awkward nods a few times since their conversation months ago, but hadn't really talked. This time, the husband approached James while they were both looking at garden supplies. "Your vegetables look good," he said. "I've noticed them from our upstairs window. Thanks. First time growing my own food? It's been a learning process. Listen, I wanted to say something. Carol's actually been doing better. Took her a while, but she's accepted the new route to the park. She even admits now that the extra walking is probably good for her heart. Her doctor said so at her last checkup." James wasn't sure how to respond to that. "That's good to hear. Between you and me, I think she needed this." Carol spent a lot of years thinking she could do whatever she wanted because she'd been here longer than everyone else. Like tenure in a neighborhood gave her special privileges. This whole thing made her realize that's not how it works. "I never wanted to make things difficult for her." "I know. You just wanted to use your own property." "That's reasonable." Paused, studying a display of fertilizer. "She won't apologize if that's what you're wondering. Too proud, but she knows she was wrong. She told our daughter that she should have asked permission from the start instead of assuming. That's probably the closest to an apology you'll get. It wasn't an actual apology, but it was something. An acknowledgement, even secondhand, that Carol understood she'd been in the wrong. James could work with that. The real surprise came in late autumn. James was raking leaves in his front yard when Carol came out to get her mail. They'd been avoiding direct interaction for months, just cold nods when they couldn't avoid seeing each other. But this time Carol stopped at the end of her driveway. "Your fence held up well through the storm," she said. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. Just neutral. Matter dash of dash fact. James stopped raking. "Yeah, the company did good work. Cedar's a good choice. Weather resistant." She collected her mail, started to walk back, then stopped. "The path I was using was never official, you know? I realize that now. I just did it for so long that I forgot it wasn't actually mine to use." It was the closest thing to an admission James had heard from her directly. "I appreciate you saying that." She nodded once and went back inside. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even forgiveness, really. But it was a detente. A mutual agreement to coexist without active hostility. In some ways, that was better than a forced apology that neither of them would have really meant. The neighborhood dynamics had shifted in unexpected ways. James had worried that standing up to Carol would make him a permanent outcast. But instead, it had earned him a quiet respect from many neighbors. They knew he wasn't a pushover. They knew he'd defend his boundaries. And somewhat surprisingly, that made them more comfortable around him, not less. People started approaching him for advice about their own boundary issues. A younger couple down the street asked how he'd handled the county land purchase, because they were having drainage problems related to an unclear property line. An older gentleman wanted to know what permits were needed for a fence because his neighbor's dogs kept getting into his yard. James had become the neighborhood's unofficial expert on property rights. which was amusing considering he'd learned everything just a few months. Earlier, out of necessity, one afternoon in early winter, James was stringing Christmas lights on his front porch when Dorothy Carroll's former walking companion stopped by with a plate of cookies. "Holiday tradition," she explained. "I make cookies for everyone on the block, even the troublemakers." She smiled to show she was joking. "I'm the troublemaker now." "Oh, honey, you were never the troublemaker. You were just the first person to say no and mean it. The neighborhood needed that. Carol needed that." Dorothy lowered her voice even though no one was around. "She's actually become easier to be friends with now. Less demanding. More aware that other people have their own needs and preferences. It's like that whole situation humbled her a little bit." After Dorothy left, James thought about that. He hadn't set out to humble anyone. He just wanted to plant tomatoes without someone walking through his garden. But maybe sometimes the consequences of our actions teach us things we need to learn. The holidays came and went. James's parents visited and loved the house, especially the backyard with its nice fence and flourishing garden beds. His mother mentioned how peaceful it felt, how private. James didn't tell her about the battle he'd fought to achieve that peace. In January, something unexpected happened. Carol knocked on his door. James answered, genuinely surprised to see her standing on his porch. "I'm organizing a neighborhood watch program," she said, businesslike. "I'm talking to everyone on the block. Would you be interested in participating? A neighborhood watch?" There were some break-ins 2 streets over. I thought we should be proactive. We'd just share phone numbers, keep an eye out for suspicious activity, that sort of thing. James was surprised she was including him, given their history. "Sure, I'd be interested." "Good, I'll add you to the email list." She started to leave, then turned back. "You're part of this neighborhood now. Whatever happened before, we're neighbors. That's just how it is." It was Carol's way of saying they'd moved past their conflict. Not that she forgave him, or that he forgave her, but that they were both choosing to function as neighbors, despite their difficult history. It was practical, pragmatic, and somehow very Carol. Over the following months, James and Carol developed what could only be described as a professional relationship. They'd wave when getting mail. They'd make small talk about weather or neighborhood issues. Carol would sometimes ask to borrow a tool, and James would lend it. When James went on vacation, Carol's husband collected his newspapers without being asked. They would never be friends. Too much had happened, and both had too much pride. But they'd found a way to exist in proximity without constant tension. And really, wasn't that all you could ask from some neighbors? James's property value increased. The fence, the improved landscaping, and the clear boundaries made his home more attractive. When a real estate agent friend did a casual appraisal, she noted that the additional land and professional fencing had added over $10,000 to the home's value. James had spent less than $1,000 to purchase the land, and a few thousand more on the fence. It had been a good investment in multiple ways. More importantly, James had learned to stand up for himself. He'd learned that being kind doesn't mean being a doormat. He'd learned that sometimes conflict is necessary to reach a peaceful resolution. He'd learned that enforcing boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable, is healthier than endless accommodation that breeds resentment. On warm evenings, James would sit on his back patio with a book and a cold drink. Listening to the birds and watching his garden grow, the fence stood solid and straight, marking clearly where his property ended and the world beyond began. That clarity felt good. The worn dirt path was long gone, buried under healthy grass and flowering plants. Sometimes James would remember how stressed he'd felt watching Carol trample through his yard every morning. How helpless he'd felt, how frustrated. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. He'd bought more than just a strip of county land. He'd bought his peace of mind. He'd bought the right to use his own property without interference. He'd bought the freedom to plant flowers where he wanted without worrying they'd be trampled, and maybe most valuably, he'd bought the knowledge that he could stand up for himself when it mattered, that he could face conflict and come out the other side, that he didn't have to accept situations that made him unhappy just because changing them was difficult. Some neighbors believed her. James would see them talking in clusters on the street, Conversations that would stop abruptly when he appeared. He'd get side glances at the grocery store from people who lived nearby. One person even left a note on his car, calling him selfish and suggesting he move if he couldn't handle living in a community. But something unexpected started happening too. Other neighbors began approaching James quietly, usually when Carol wasn't around. They'd knock on his door or catch him while he was mowing the lawn. They'd share their own stories. A guy named Robert, from 2 streets over, was first. "Hey, I heard about your fence situation. Just wanted to say good for you. Carol's been using my driveway to turn around for years. Just pulls right in, backs out, doesn't ask. I mentioned it to her once, and she acted like I was being petty. Said she'd been doing it forever, and her car was too big to turn around in her own driveway. I didn't push it because I didn't want problems, but honestly, it's annoying." Then there was Angela, who lived across the street from Carol. "She's been having her lawn service blow all her grass clippings into my yard for 3 years. Every single week during mowing season, my lawn gets covered with her clippings. I asked her about it once, and she said I should be grateful because it's free mulch. Free mulch that kills my grass and looks terrible." Stories kept coming. Carol had apparently spent years assuming privileges that nobody had actually granted her. She'd just acted entitled enough that most people went along with it rather than cause conflict. James had just been the first one to actually draw a hard line and enforce it. Mr. Chen stopped by again, this time with his wife. "We wanted to tell you something. About 10 years ago, Carol decided that the sidewalk in front of our house was too narrow for her morning walks with both dogs. So she started walking them on our grass instead, right along the edge of our lawn. Killed a strip of grass about 2 feet wide all along the front. When we asked her to use the sidewalk, she said the sidewalk was public property and she could walk wherever she wanted near it. She was walking on your grass." For months, finally I installed those little decorative border fences, the short ones that are only like 6 inches tall. It's just enough to mark the boundary. Carol complained to everyone who would listen that I was being hostile and unwelcoming, but the grass grew back. These conversations made James feel less alone, but they also made him sad. How many people had Carol pushed around over the years? How many small violations had she gotten away with because people didn't want to be seen? Is difficult? Carol's lawyer sent James's lawyer a letter threatening legal action for deliberately disrupting established patterns of use. James's lawyer responded with copies of all the property documents. It's a cease and desist letter Carol had signed for, photographic evidence of her continued trespassing, and a polite suggestion that Carol's attorney advise his client to drop the matter before it got more expensive. James never heard about it again. Apparently even Carol's lawyer had told her she didn't have a case. But Carol wasn't done. She couldn't win legally, she'd win socially. She started a neighborhood Facebook group specifically to discuss preserving neighborhood character and tradition. The description mentioned newcomers who don't understand community values and the importance of flexibility and mutual support. She didn't name James, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The group got about 20 members, mostly people who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and felt nostalgic about the way things used to be. They'd post about how neighbors used to be friendlier, how people used to help each other out, how nobody used to be so hung up on property lines and rules. James didn't join the group, but friends would send him screenshots. It was frustrating to watch his character get assassinated online by people who didn't know the full story. But he also noticed something interesting. For every person agreeing with Carol, there was someone pushing back, pointing out that respecting boundaries is also part of being a good neighbor. Robert actually posted in the group about Carol using his driveway. Angela posted about the grass clippings. Mr. Chen shared the story about his lawn. Suddenly, Carol's narrative of being victimized by a hostile newcomer started falling apart. Other people had dealt with her boundary issues too. James wasn't an outlier. He was just the first one who'd done something about it. Carol tried to defend herself, but it came across as defensive and entitled. "Those were all small favors that good neighbors should be happy to provide," she wrote. "I've lived here for decades and contributed greatly to this community. These minor inconveniences should be accepted as part of living in a neighborhood." Someone replied, "But who gets to decide what's a minor inconvenience? If it's my property, shouldn't I get to decide?" The Facebook group slowly turned from an echo chamber for Carol into an actual discussion about boundaries and respect. James never posted in it, but he appreciated others speaking up. Meanwhile, Carol had to adjust her morning routine. James would see her sometimes, leaving her house earlier now, taking the long way around the block to get to the park. She looked angry every time, her jaw set, her steps heavy. She'd glare at his fence like it had personally wronged her. One morning, about a month after the fence went up, James was having coffee on his back patio when he heard raised voices from Carol's yard. He couldn't help but overhear. Carol was arguing with her daughter. "I'm just saying, Mom, maybe it's time to let this go. You're making yourself miserable. He had no right to do what he did. Not every right. You were walking through his property without permission? I looked it up. I even talked to a lawyer friend. You don't have a case. It's the principle of the thing. This used to be a neighborhood where people cared about each other. Caring about each other goes both ways, Mom. You never asked if you could use that path. You just assumed. And when he asked you to stop, you ignored him. What did you think would happen?" There was silence, then Carol's voice, smaller. Mr. Peterson never minded. "Mr. Peterson isn't there anymore. This is James's house now. You have to accept that." James felt strange listening to this. He hadn't wanted to make Carol miserable. He'd just wanted to use his own backyard in peace. No. But he'd been backed into a corner where the only option was to take dramatic action. Around this time, something shifted in the neighborhood. The people who'd been cold to James started warming up a bit. Maybe they'd heard the other stories about Carol. Maybe they'd realized his fence wasn't an act of aggression but a defensive move. Maybe they just got tired of the drama and wanted things to calm down. Patricia from next door brought over cookies one afternoon. I may have been a bit harsh when this all started. Carol got to me with her version of events first. But I've been hearing other stories, and I want to apologize for judging you without knowing the full situation. James accepted the cookies and the apology. I never wanted to be the neighborhood problem. I just wanted to plant some flowers. I know, and your fence looks nice. Really good craftsmanship. Even some of Carol's closest friends started backing away from her. One of them, a woman named Dorothy who'd walked with Carol sometimes, approached James at the mailbox one day. "I just wanted you to know I won't be walking through your yard with Carol anymore." She asked me to, said we could both just hop the fence as a statement of protest. I told her that was crazy. I'm not trespassing on someone's property to make a point. I appreciate that. For what it's worth, I think Carol needed someone to finally stand up to her. She's gotten away with a lot over the years because she's so insistent, and most people just give in. My husband calls it her steamroller technique. She just keeps pushing until people are too exhausted to say no. James realized that's exactly what had happened with Mr. Peterson. The old man had probably been too tired, or too conflict-averse to fight Carol. He'd just let her do what she ate. Wanted because it was easier than dealing with the confrontation. And Carol had interpreted his exhaustion as permission. The fence stood firm through summer storms and fall winds. James planted a garden along it, flowers and vegetables growing where the dirt path used to be. His backyard became the peaceful retreat he'd imagined when he bought the house. He'd put a small patio set out there and would sit in the evenings with a book. Enjoying the privacy, Carol still lived next door. She still made her disapproval clear whenever their paths crossed, but she'd stopped actively fighting him. The Facebook group had mostly died down. The neighborhood gossip had moved on to other topics. Life had returned to something like normal. James had learned an important lesson about boundaries. Being kind doesn't mean letting people walk all over you, literally or figuratively. Sometimes. The kindest thing you can do is enforce clear boundaries so everyone knows where they stand. It might be uncomfortable in the moment, but it's better than years of resentment building up. 6 months after the fence went up, James had settled into a comfortable routine in his home. His garden was thriving, full of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. The flower beds along the fence bloomed with color. The grass had completely grown back where Carol's path used to be. Sometimes James would stand in his backyard and try to remember exactly where that dirt trail had been, but it was getting harder to picture. James started researching fences. He looked at chain link, wood panels, vinyl, metal. He read reviews and compared prices. He checked the local zoning codes to see what was allowed. In his neighborhood, Fences could be up to 6 feet tall without special permits. They had to be set back at least 2 inches from the property line. There were some rules about corner lots and sight lines, but none of that applied to his backyard. He got quotes from 3 different fence companies. The middle quote seemed the most reasonable, from a local company that had good reviews and could start work within 2 weeks. James went with cedar wood, a nice-looking fence that would last for years. 6 feet tall, privacy style, with posts set in concrete. The kind of fence that made a statement. The fence company needed a copy of his survey to make sure they were building on his property. James provided the new survey, the one that showed his extended property line. The crew would install the fence exactly where it belonged, right along the boundary between his land and the county land he'd purchased, which meant the fence would be 8 feet closer to Carol's house than she probably expected. He didn't tell Carol about the fence. He'd tried being communicative, tried being reasonable, tried following proper procedures. She'd ignored all of it. She'd literally signed for a cease and desist letter and then kept trespassing anyway. At this point, James figured she'd find out about the fence when it appeared. 2 weeks later, on a Monday morning, the fence company showed up with their trucks and equipment. James had taken the day off work to be there. The crew was professional and efficient. They started by marking exactly where the fence would go, using the survey markers and measuring everything precisely. Carol's dog started barking immediately. James saw Carol come out her back door, coffee mug in hand, to see what the commotion was. Her face, when she saw the fence company, was almost comical. She stood there in her bathrobe, mouth open, just staring. Then she marched over. "What is going on here?" The crew foreman glanced at James, who nodded. "We're installing a fence, ma'am." "For the property owner here? A fence? Right here? This is ridiculous. You can't build a fence here." The foreman pulled out the survey map. "We're building exactly on the property line, ma'am. Everything's been measured and marked according to the county survey. This is harassment. This is targeted harassment." Carol turned to James. "You're doing this to punish me?" James kept his voice calm. "I'm doing this to protect my property. You were asked to stop trespassing. You refused. So now I'm installing a fence, which is my legal right as a property owner. My lawyer is going to hear about this. Your lawyer will tell you the same thing mine told me. I can build a fence on my own property as long as it meets zoning requirements. This fence meets all requirements." Carol looked at the fence line, seemed to be calculating something in her head. "This is closer to my house than the old property line, because I now own what used to be the county land. The land your path was on? It's all documented and legal." A woman James didn't recognize appeared from Carol's house. "Mom, what's wrong?" "This man is building a fence to block my walking path. The path I've used for 15 years. The daughter looked at James, then at the fence crew, trying to figure out what was happening. "Can you do that?" "He absolutely can," the foreman said, sounding a bit tired. "And we've got a job to do, so if you folks don't mind stepping back to a safe distance." Carol called someone on her phone, angry and loud. James caught phrases like harassment and hostile neighbor and lawyer immediately. He felt bad for about 5 seconds, then reminded himself that he'd tried every reasonable approach first. This wasn't his first choice. This was his last resort. The fence went up fast. The crew knew what they were doing. By the end of the first day, all the posts were in. By the end of the second day, the panels were up. By the end of the third day, the whole fence was complete, stained a nice cedar color. Standing 6 feet tall and solid, Carol's path was now completely blocked. From her back gate, she could see nothing but fence. The gap in the old fence that led to James's property was now sealed off on his side by new cedar panels. There was no way through unless she wanted to climb over, which would be even more obviously trespassing than walking through had been. James stood in his backyard that evening, after the crew had left, looking at his new fence. His yard felt private for the first time since he'd moved in. No more worry about Carol appearing at any moment. No more dogs digging in his garden. No more feeling like his backyard was public space. Carol came out and stood at her gate, staring at the fence with an expression James couldn't quite read. Anger, definitely. But also something else. Maybe disbelief that he'd actually gone through with it. Maybe realization that she'd pushed too far and he'd push back harder. Over the next few days, the neighborhood got very interested in James's new fence. People would walk by slowly, looking at it. James could see them calculating where the property line must have been before, where it was now. A few neighbors stopped by to ask questions. Old Mr. Chen from 3 houses down knocked on his door one afternoon. Nice fence. Good craftsmanship. Did you really buy that strip of county land? I did. It was for sale, so I bought it. Mr. Chen smiled slightly. Smart. Very smart. Carol has been talking about adverse possession and implied easements all over the neighborhood. I looked it up. She doesn't have a case, does she? My attorney says no. Good, don't let her bully you. She's done this kind of thing before. My son used to play basketball in our driveway until Carol complained to the HOA that it was too noisy. Except we don't have an HOA. She just made it sound official enough that my son felt uncomfortable and stopped playing. Some people think if they act entitled enough, everyone will just go along with it. That made James feel a bit better. At least someone in the neighborhood understood, but others weren't as supportive. A woman named Patricia from next door gave him cold looks when she saw him getting his mail. Another neighbor, whose name James didn't even know, made a comment about people who can't get along with others loud enough for him to hear. Carol ramped up her complaints. She called the county zoning office. An inspector came out, measured everything, checked the permits, and confirmed that the fence was completely legal and properly installed. She called the police. An officer came out, listened to her story about the old path and the new fence, then politely explained that property owners have the right to fence their property and that continuing to cross someone's land after being told not to was trespassing James. James documented all of it. Every complaint Carol filed, every official who came to investigate, every result that confirmed he was in the right. He kept all the paperwork organized, just in case this somehow ended up in court. Carol's husband finally knocked on James's door one evening. He looked tired and a little embarrassed. Can we talk for a minute? James invited him in. They sat in the living room, and for a moment neither spoke. Look, the husband finally said, I know Carol's been difficult about all this. She has a hard time letting go of routines. That path was part of her daily life for a long time. I understand that. But it's my property. I asked her nicely to stop. Multiple times, I know. And legally, you're right. I've told her that. My own lawyer told her that. But she's stubborn. She thinks if she makes enough noise, you'll back down. I won't. The husband nodded. I didn't think so. That fence makes that pretty clear. He paused. I'm not here to ask you to take it down or anything. I'm just here to say that this has gotten out of hand and I'm sorry. Carol should have listened when you first asked. This all could have been avoided. It was the closest thing to an apology James was likely to get. I appreciate you saying that. She's going to have to use the sidewalk now. It's longer, but it's not like it's impossible. She's just mad that someone finally told her no. After Carol's husband left, James stood at his back window looking at the fence. The evening sun lit up the cedar panels, making them glow warm and golden. His garden was growing back where the path used to be. The grass was filling in. His backyard was finally starting to look the way he'd imagined it when he bought the house. He'd stood his ground. He'd used the law properly and defended his rights. And somehow, despite doing everything correctly, he still felt like the bad guy to half the neighborhood. But the fence stood solid, and behind it, his property was his own again. The first week after the fence went up was strange. James would catch himself listening for Carol's footsteps in his backyard at 7:15 each morning. But they never came. The silence felt almost louder than her presence had been. He'd check his backyard multiple times a day, half expecting to find that she'd somehow found a way through. But the fence stood solid, and his yard remained empty except for the birds and occasional squirrels. Carol, meanwhile, had launched a full campaign. She'd printed flyers about property rights abuse and hostile neighbors, and left them in mailboxes up and down the street. She conveniently left out the part about repeatedly trespassing after being asked to stop. Her version of events made James sound like a monster who'd bought land specifically to torment a senior citizen, trying to exercise for her health. And I'm telling you that this is bigger than your yard. This is about neighborhood relationships, about give and take, about understanding that we all make little accommodations for each other. Do you know how many times I've done favors for people on this street? Do you know how many times I've watered plants or collected mail or watched houses when people were on vacation? James felt his frustration building. Those things aren't the same as walking through someone's private property every day. They absolutely are the same. They're about being flexible and kind and community-minded. But I can see you're not interested in any of that. You just want to lock yourself away in your little fortress and not be bothered by anyone. She turned back to her roses, clearly ending the conversation. James stood there for another moment, then walked back to his house feeling worse than before. How had he become the villain in this situation? All he wanted was to enjoy his own backyard without daily intrusions. The walks continued. Carol now had a tight-lipped expression whenever she passed through. No more friendly waves or comments. She'd recruited her husband to her side too. James had tried to introduce himself once over the fence and the man had just grunted and walked away. Word was apparently spreading through the neighborhood that the new guy was difficult. James started researching property law online late at night. He learned about easements and adverse possession and property rights. The more he read, the more worried he became. In some states, if someone used a path across your property for long enough without objection, they could actually claim a legal right to continue using it. 15 years seemed like it might be long enough. He also discovered something interesting in the county property records. The exact area where Carol's path crossed from her yard to his wasn't technically on either of their properties. There was a narrow strip of land, maybe 8 or 10 feet wide, that belonged to the county. It was labeled as unclaimed parcel on the old survey maps. Probably some left over from when the neighborhood was first developed decades ago. James stared at that map for a long time. An idea was forming, but he wasn't sure if it was brilliant or crazy. The next morning, he went to the county land office. The clerk there was helpful, if a bit surprised by his question. Yes, that strip of land was still county-owned. No, nobody had ever tried to claim it. Yes, theoretically, someone could purchase it if they wanted. The price would be minimal since it was such a small, odd-shaped piece that wasn't useful for much. Would I be able to buy it? James asked. The clerk shrugged. Don't see why not. We'd have to verify the survey, make sure there aren't any utility easements or anything complicated. But if it's just sitting there unclaimed, the county would probably be happy to get it off the books. Budget cuts, you know. Every little bit helps. James filed an application that day. He also contacted a real estate attorney to make sure he was doing everything correctly. The lawyer thought the whole situation was amusing and agreed to help him navigate the process. 2 weeks later, James was sitting in the attorney's office, going over the paperwork. So once this goes through, that strip of land becomes part of my property? James asked. That's right. It'll extend your property line closer to Carol's house. The survey markers will be moved and the new boundaries will be recorded with the county and the path she's been using. Will be entirely on your property at that point. If she continues using it without your permission, it's trespassing. Clear cut. James signed the papers. The whole thing cost him less than $1,000 between the land purchase and legal fees. Probably the best money he'd ever spent. He didn't tell Carol right away. He wanted all the paperwork finalized first. While he waited for the county to process everything, he started documenting Carol's daily walks. He took photos with timestamps, showing her and her dogs crossing through his yard. He made notes of damage to his plants. He kept all the evidence organized in a folder, just in case. Carol seemed to sense something was different. She'd catch him taking photos sometimes and would glare at him, but she didn't say anything. Her friends stopped coming on the morning walks. Maybe Carol had complained about the hostile neighbor, and the friend didn't want to deal with it. 3 weeks after filing the paperwork, James got the call. The land purchase was complete. The new survey had been filed. The strip of formerly county land was now legally his. His property line had just moved 8 feet in Carol's direction, and every inch of that worn dirt path was now unquestionably on his property that evening. James printed out copies of the deed, the survey map, And all the relevant documentation? He put them in a folder and walked over to Carol's house. His heart was pounding. He'd never been good with confrontation, but this had to be done. Carol answered the door, looking suspicious. What do you want? I need to talk to you about the property line situation. Can I come in for a minute? No. Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. James opened the folder and handed her a copy of the new survey map. I purchased the county land between our properties. As of last week, I own that entire strip. The path you've been using runs completely through my property now. Carol stared at the papers, her face going from confused to angry. You did what? I legally purchased land that was available for sale? The same land you've been walking across for 15 years without owning it or having any legal right to it? This is ridiculous. You can't just buy land to spite your neighbors. I didn't do it to spite you. I did it to protect my property rights. You've been trespassing, Carol. You've been crossing land that wasn't yours or mine, and now it's mine. Her husband appeared behind her. What's going on? Carol thrust the papers at him. He bought the property line. He actually went out and bought land just to block my walking path. The husband looked at the survey map, then at James. Is this legal? Completely legal. The county land office can confirm everything. I have the deed right here. This is insane, Carol said. You're insane. Who does something like this? Someone who asked nicely multiple times and was ignored. Someone whose property rights were being violated every single day. Someone who got tired of being called unreasonable for wanting to use his own backyard. Carol's face was red now. I'm calling my lawyer. This can't be legal. There has to be some kind of rule about adverse possession or something. I've been using that path for 15 years. Your lawyer will tell you the same thing mine told me. Adverse possession requires several conditions to be met. The use has to be hostile, meaning against the owner's interests. Mr. Peterson tolerated your walking through, which means it wasn't hostile. You also never maintained the land or paid taxes on it. And now the land has a new owner who's explicitly telling you that you're not welcome. There's no adverse possession claim. James handed her another sheet of paper. This is a formal notice that you're no longer permitted to cross my property. If you continue to do so, I'll have to take legal action for trespassing. Carol looked like she wanted to scream. Her husband put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off. You are the worst neighbor I've ever had. Mr. Peterson would be ashamed of you. Mr. Peterson isn't here. I am, and I'm done being walked over, literally and figuratively. James turned and walked back to his house, his hand shaking slightly. Behind him, he could hear Carol ranting to her husband about lawyers and rights and the way neighborhoods used to be. He closed his door and sat down on his couch, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or finally taken control of a situation that had been bothering him for months. The morning after, James delivered the property documents to Carol. He watched from his kitchen window at 7:15. Right on schedule, Carol appeared at her back gate with her 2 dogs. She looked toward his house, hesitated for just a moment, then proceeded onto what was now definitely his property. James took out his phone and photographed her from the window. She had to know he could see her. She had to know she was now officially trespassing. But she walked through anyway, her chin up, her expression defiant. It was like she was daring him to do something about it. He didn't confront her that day. Instead, he called his attorney and sent the photos. She's still using the path. What do I do now? The attorney sighed. We send a certified letter. Formal cease and desist. If she continues after receiving that, we can pursue trespassing charges, though honestly, most judges would rather see neighbors work these things out, but the letter will establish a clear record that she was warned. The certified letter went out that afternoon. Carol signed for it 2 days later. James got the notification on his phone. For one day, Carol didn't come through his yard. He thought maybe she'd finally gotten the message. But the next morning, she was back. Same time, same route, same dogs. This time she didn't even glance toward his house. She kept her eyes straight ahead. walking through like she had every right to be there. James felt something shift inside him. Carol wasn't going to stop. She decided that her 15-year-old habit trumped his legal property rights. She decided that her convenience mattered more than his peace of mind. She was counting on him backing down, on him not wanting to cause more problems, on him being too uncomfortable with conflict to follow through. She'd miscalculated. When James bought his first house, he felt like he'd finally made it. After years of renting cramped apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors through paper-thin walls, he had his own place with a backyard, a real backyard with grass and trees, and even a little garden area where the previous owner had grown tomatoes. The house wasn't fancy, but it was his. That's all that mattered. The moving truck had barely pulled away when he noticed something odd. There was a path worn into the grass that cut diagonally across his backyard. Not a decorative path made of stones or anything intentional. This was just dead grass and packed dirt, where something or someone had walked so many times that nothing grew there anymore. It started at the back corner near his neighbor's fence and cut straight through what looked like it used to be a flower bed, ending at the side gate. James figured maybe the previous owner had made the path himself. Old Mr. Peterson had lived there for decades, according to the realtor. Maybe he liked to walk that route to check his mail or something. James made a mental note to reseed that area once he got settled in. He had bigger things to worry about, like unpacking boxes and figuring out why the kitchen sink made that weird gurgling noise. 3 days later, James was in his kitchen making coffee when movement in his backyard caught his eye. A woman he'd never seen before had just walked through his side gate. 2 big golden dogs on leashes, and was cutting across his yard like she owned the place. She wasn't sneaking or hurrying. She was just casually strolling through his property like it was a public park. James stood there with his coffee mug halfway to his lips, completely confused. The woman disappeared through an opening in the back fence that James hadn't even noticed before. It wasn't a gate exactly, just a gap where a board was missing. He watched the space where she'd vanished, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. But the next morning at the same time, she was back. Same to dogs, same casual stroll, same route. This time James went outside to introduce himself and politely asked what was going on. The woman's name was Carol, and she lived in the house directly behind his. She seemed genuinely surprised that he'd even brought it up. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said with a big smile. "Mr. Peterson never minded. I've been cutting through here for years. It's so much faster than going all the way around the block to get to the park." James tried to process this. "You've been walking through his yard every day? Every morning, rain or shine?" "Well, except when I'm out of town. Your yard connects perfectly to the walking trail. If I go around the streetway, it adds almost 15 minutes to my walk." Mr. Peterson was such a sweet man. He understood that good neighbors help each other out. Before James could figure out what to say to that, Carol waved goodbye and continued on her way, her dogs pulling at their leashes. He stood there in his pajamas, holding his coffee, feeling like he'd just been swept up in something he didn't quite understand. Over the next few weeks, James tried to settle into his new home and ignored the daily intrusions. Carol would wave cheerfully every morning when she saw him. Sometimes she'd call out compliments about the yard or ask how he was adjusting to the neighborhood. She seemed nice enough, and James didn't want to be that neighbor who started problems right away. Maybe this was just how things worked here. Maybe he was being uptight about the whole thing. But it started to bother him more and more. Carol's dogs didn't stay on the worn path. They'd pull toward his garden area, sniffing around and occasionally digging. Twice he found dog waste in his yard that Carol apparently didn't notice or chose to ignore. The path itself was getting worse, not better. Where James had hoped grass might start growing back, the dirt was getting more packed down and spreading wider. He'd bought this house specifically because it had a nice backyard. He'd had plans. He wanted to plant flowers, maybe put in some vegetables, create a little outdoor space where he could relax on weekends. But every morning at 7:15, Carol and her dogs would trample through. And every morning James would feel that little spike of irritation. This was supposed to be his private space one Saturday. James was outside trying to plant some new flowers along the fence line. He'd bought pansies and marigolds from the garden center, excited to add some color to the yard. He was on his knees, trowel in hand, when Carol appeared. "Oh, are you planting flowers right there?" she asked, sounding concerned. "That's kind of in the middle of the path. Maybe you should put them somewhere else." James sat back on his heels. "This is my yard, Carol. I can plant flowers wherever I want." She laughed like he'd made a joke. "Well, sure, technically. But be practical. My dogs and I come through here every day. We'll probably just trample them anyway. Why make more work for yourself?" Mr. Peterson kept this area clear for exactly that reason. Something snapped in James that day. "Carol, I need to be honest with you. I'm not comfortable with you walking through my yard anymore. I know Mr. Peterson allowed it, but I'd prefer if you used the sidewalk." The smile dropped from Carol's face. "Are you serious right now?" "I am. I'm sorry, but this is my property, and I'd like my privacy." Carol stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Peterson never had a problem with it." "I'm not Mr. Peterson." "I can see that," she said coldly. "Mr. Peterson was a kind man who understood what it means to be neighborly. This is how things work in this neighborhood. We help each other out. We're flexible. We're community-minded." James felt his face getting hot. "I'm just asking you to use the public sidewalk like everyone else. The public sidewalk that adds 15 minutes to my morning walk. Do you know I'm out there every single day at dawn? I'm 62 years old, and my doctor says I need to keep up my exercise routine. This shortcut has been part of my routine for 15 years. I understand that, but no, I don't think you do understand. This is about more than just a path. This is about being a good neighbor. This is about respecting traditions that were established long before you got here. You've been here, what, a month? And you're already trying to change everything?" James didn't know what to say. Carol shook her head, called to her dogs, and walked away through his yard one more time. He watched her go, feeling frustrated and guilty at the same time. Was he being unreasonable? Was this really that big of a deal? He tried to talk himself into letting it go. It was just a few minutes every morning. Carol seemed to really need this routine. Maybe he should be more flexible, more understanding. Maybe this was just part of living in a neighborhood. But then Carol's dogs dug up his newly planted pansies. Then he found more dog waste near his tomato plants. Then Carol started bringing her friend along on walks. So now there were 2 women and 4 dogs trampling through his yard every morning. The path was getting wider and more damaged. James realized that Carol had taken his silence as permission. She'd interpreted his failure to enforce boundaries as acceptance of the situation, and now he was trapped. If he said something again, he'd look like the bad guy, the difficult neighbor, the outsider who didn't understand how things work here. He lay awake at night, listening to the sounds of his new house settling, thinking about that path through his yard. It seemed like such a small thing, but it represented something bigger. This was his home, his property, his space. He'd worked hard to afford this place, and he should be able to enjoy it without feeling like his backyard was community property. Something had to change. James just wasn't sure what he could do about it. James decided to try one more time to talk to Carol like adults. He caught her on a Sunday afternoon when she was gardening in her own yard. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, trying to sound reasonable and neighborly while still being firm about his boundaries. "Carol, hey, do you have a minute?" She looked up from her roses, and he could already see the defensive look in her eyes. "What is it?" "I wanted to talk again about the path situation. I know we got off on the wrong foot last time, and I'm sorry if I came across as harsh. But I really need you to start using the sidewalk. My garden is getting destroyed, and I'm finding dog waste in my yard pretty regularly." Carol stood up, brushing dirt off her gardening gloves. "My dogs don't go to the bathroom in your yard, James. I always clean up after them. There was some just yesterday, near my vegetable garden. Well, that wasn't from my dogs. Maybe you have wild animals or something." "Raccoons? Probably." James took a deep breath. "Okay, but even setting that aside, the path itself is killing my grass. I've been trying to plant flowers, and they keep getting trampled. I've been really patient about this, but I need it to stop." "Patient." Carol laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been here 2 months, and you're already making demands. Mr. Peterson lived here for 30 years and never once complained. I keep hearing about Mr. Peterson. But Mr. Peterson doesn't live here anymore. I do. And I'm asking you, as politely as I can, to please respect my property. Carol crossed her arms. You know what your problem is? You're one of these young people who moves into an established neighborhood and expects everything to revolve around you. You don't care about the community that was here before you. You just want what you want. That's not fair. I'm literally just asking you not to walk through my yard.